It is a real pleasure and honor for us to welcome the Ambassador here today. Not only does the Ambassador of India represent one of the most significant political actors in the world today, but it fills a special need for us here on campus. We are acutely aware here at the Kennedy Center that South Asia is one of our weaker areas of focus. So the Ambassador's visit provides us the opportunity to strengthen in an area where we need strengthening. Ambassador Mansingh has been the ambassador to the United States since March 15th of 2001. Prior to his posting here, he has had appointments in the UK, in the UAE, in Nigeria, in various diplomatic capacities in Geneva, Afghanistan, and Belgium. He brings with him a wealth of diplomatic experience. We're honored that he would visit us here today, and we invite you to join me in welcoming Ambassador Mansingh.
Thank you. Thank you for those kind words. Vice President Sandra Rogers, Vice President Peterson, Professor Ringer, Professor Corey Leonard, my colleague Consul General Vishwanathan, distinguished faculty and students and friends. I'm thankful to Vice President Peterson for his long-standing invitation to me to visit Utah and address the Ambassadors Series in this university. And I'm immensely grateful for the opportunity to be with you this afternoon and share my thoughts with this distinguished international audience. There is a special place in history for prophets with a vision who lead their followers towards a promised destination. Like the prophet Moses, who led the Hebrews through the wilderness for 40 years in search of the promised land. Or Mahatma Gandhi, in more recent times, leading millions of Indians towards freedom, urging his followers to deploy truth and non-violence as weapons in a just struggle. In 1930, Mahatma Gandhi led thousands of Indian freedom fighters in a symbolic march 250 miles to the seashore and scooped up a handful of salt from the ground. Known as the famous Salt March, this simple act of defiance against the mighty British Empire was the turning point in India's quest for freedom. I have come to Utah and to this university in a spirit of pilgrimage, to pay homage to the prophets like Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, and recognize the heroism of the hardy pioneers who made the desert bloom with the help of handcarts, wheelbarrows, and their Christian faith. Mahatma Gandhi, like the Latter-day Saints, also believed that faith could move mountains. He would have felt a spiritual kinship with prophets Joseph Smith and Brigham Young. India is an ancient nation with a civilization whose roots go back to 10,000 years. What has held India together through the ups and downs of history is the deep spirituality of our people. 4 of the world's 8 major religions originated on Indian soil. 4 other great religions, Judaism, Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and Islam, came to India from outside and were welcomed and given pride of place in our society. The first Christian to set foot in India was St. Thomas the Apostle in 58 AD. Christianity in India is thus almost as old as Christianity itself. A brief knowledge of India of the past, the eternal India as we like to call it, is essential for understanding contemporary India. Before I speak on the state of relations with the United States, let me briefly take you back to India 5 decades ago. To 1947, the year India achieved independence from British colonial rule. Friends, when we stood on the threshold of independence in 1947, the future of our infant nation seemed most uncertain. The British withdrawal from India and the attempt to leave behind a balkanized India posed a real danger to the emergence of a United Nations state. We were a nation with one of the largest populations, most of whom were poor and illiterate. We were also a country with staggering diversity, with 8 major religions, 19 principal languages, and several thousand dialects. Administering this state was a heroic challenge. Our economy had been ravaged by centuries of colonial exploitation. At independence, India was exporting raw materials and importing finished products. We depended on food imports and charity to feed our nation. The partition of India had left a bitterly divided India. It was a grim scenario in 1947. On 15th August 1947, when the rest of India was celebrating independence, Mahatma Gandhi slipped away from Delhi to quietly shed tears on the violence and bloodshed which accompanied the partition of India. His heart was broken. Nevertheless, the leaders of India undertook the challenge of nation building with vision and courage. In many ways, our tryst with democracy was one of the greatest experiments in history, comparable to that of the American and the French revolutions. 5 decades later, we salute today the founding fathers of India for the unshaking faith they reposed in democracy, freedom, and the rule of law. India has gone through 5 tumultuous decades through floods, famine, war, and internal disturbance, without ever diverting from the path of democracy. We have proudly remained the world's largest democracy. By October next year, the world will witness yet again the greatest democratic show on earth, when 600 million Indians will go to the elections to choose the next federal government. We started in 1947 as one of the world's most impoverished nations, with 75% of the population living below the poverty line, with a life expectancy of 47 years and a literacy level of around 15%. Today, 75% of our population live above the poverty line. Life expectancy is around 63 years and literacy is more than 65%. Goldman Sachs have recently published a report projecting that India would emerge as the 3rd largest economy by 2050. We are already the 4th largest economy on the basis of the purchasing power parity theory. India's average annual GDP growth for the last decade has been above 6%, a robust growth considering the depressed condition of the rest of the world during this period. This year we have witnessed a record food grains production of 220 million tons. Our food stocks are at an all-time high, and we are now in the fortunate position of exporting food grains. From the less than $1 billion we had in reserves in 1991, our foreign currency reserves are now around $95 billion. Our exports grew by 20% last year, even though sluggish market conditions prevail all over the world. Industrial growth is going up. Our booming consumer market, with perhaps the largest middle class the world offers, the largest middle class in the world, offers foreign investors a bonanza of opportunities. Our USP is that we offer foreign investors a democratic framework, an open society, the rule of law, and an environment strongly supportive of free economic enterprise. The new spirit of economic freedom in India is palpable. India today is vibrant, confident, and upwardly mobile. With these preliminary remarks, I would now like to turn to Indo-U.S. relations. Let us look at our bilateral relations through the prism of 3 key components. The first component is political and strategic. As an axiom, political relations are the key components in bilateral relations. Being the two largest democracies in the world, India and the USA share common values and face common global challenges. People wonder why it took so long for the two countries to come closer to each other. The answer lies in the Cold War. During the Cold War, the US and India had different worldviews and differing perceptions of each other. India's strong desire to maintain an independent role in world affairs did not fit with the US strategic outlook in the 60s and the 70s. With the myopia of the Cold War behind us, the relationship has opened up to new possibilities. Our cooperation not only managed to transcend the routine, but also touched new areas with enhancing understanding on sensitive issues of security and strategic importance. To quote our Prime Minister, Mr. Vajpayee, during his visit to New York in September this year, and I quote, "The range and frequency of the India-U.S. dialogue has increased considerably in recent times. It covers global and regional matters, as well as long-term and near-term issues. But most significantly, it is the atmosphere of our dialogue that has changed. We now address each other with the confidence and candor of friends. The dialogue based on respect and equality is successful precisely because we have recognized that there is no fundamental conflict of interest between us. We work together on areas of agreement and frankly discuss our differing perceptions without affecting our relationship. This reflects the growing maturity of our friendship." Unquote. The last 3 years have seen an unprecedented exchange of high-level visits. While we have had visits by Prime Minister Vajpayee, Deputy Prime Minister Advani, Defense Minister George Fernandes, External Affairs Minister Sinha, Finance Minister Jaswant Singh, National Security Advisor Brijesh Mishra, and other high dignitaries. From the US side, we've had several visits by Defense Secretary Rumsfeld, Secretary of State Powell, Deputy Secretary Armitage, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Myers, and a host of other senior officials. The relationship is being transformed through an intensive dialogue covering a broad agenda, which includes new vistas which we had earlier feared to tread. This includes civilian nuclear cooperation, civilian space cooperation, high technology commerce, and missile defense. India and the US have established over 15 institutional forums that meet regularly. As outlined in President Bush's National Security Strategy Doctrine, the United States views India as a growing world power with which it has common strategic interests. The most visible manifestation of this relationship has been in defense cooperation. This has included combined special operations, training, exchange of personnel at all levels, and joint ground, sea, and air exercises. In the past 2 years, India and the United States have conducted 7 joint military exercises. Besides naval exercises in the Arabian Sea and joint patrolling of the Straits of Malacca, the armies on both sides have competed to offer the most challenging environment for their joint operations. They have carried out exercises in the tropical heat of Agra in May 2000, in the freezing climes of Alaska in October 2002, the dense jungles of Mizoram in February 2003, and in the Pacific island of Guam in June this year. More recently, in October, US Special Forces and our mountain divisions were exercising together at heights of 18 to 20,000 feet in Ladakh in Jammu and Kashmir. Even 4 years ago, such an engagement between our troops would have been unimaginable. Fighting international terrorism remains the highest priority of the administrations of both the United States and India. Our cooperation with the US in the area of counterterrorism began much before September 11. But 9/11 gave this aspect an added urgency. India has been the victim of cross-border terrorism from Pakistan for more than 2 decades. Even after 9/11, these terrorist attacks have continued. The assault on the Parliament of India, the attack on the Assembly building of Jammu and Kashmir, attacks on temples and places of worship, the brutal slaying of innocent women and children in Mumbai and other cities are a few instances of the barbarism of misguided terrorists masquerading as religious warriors. India has lost 65,000 innocent lives in the past 2 decades. More than 3,000 have been killed after September 11th. For India, the war against terrorism is universal, and there can be no two ways or two standards to fight this menace. It is no longer acceptable for a terrorist to claim to be a freedom fighter. There cannot be good terrorism and bad terrorism. Nor can there be a distinction between your terrorism and my terrorism. The events of 9/11 only brought this stark reality closer to the United States. It is not through separate efforts, but by joint action alone, that the global threat of terrorism can be eliminated. The second component of our engagement is trade, commerce, and economic relations. It is natural that one of the largest markets in the world, with a booming middle class, should attract the largest capitalist economy in the world. The U.S. has been India's largest trading partner and foreign investor. The bilateral trade in goods and services in 2002, including the export of software, was around $25 billion, a growth of 20% over the previous year. In the current year, we expect the bilateral trade to exceed $30 billion. During the past decades, U.S. businesses have invested $3 billion in India through foreign direct investment and about $8 billion through foreign institutional investment. Several U.S. companies are doing extremely well in India. Surprisingly, this is not a fact that is very well known in the United States. These days, there is so much public focus on the outsourcing issue that the success stories of U.S. companies in India have gone unnoticed. General Electric, Walmart, Whirlpool, Ford, Pepsi, Coca-Cola, Dell, Microsoft, IBM, Intel, Sun Microsystems, Procter & Gamble. These are but a few of the numerous American companies which have an established base in India and which have captured a significant share of the Indian market. The opening up of sectors like insurance, banking, financial institutions, and mutual funds have witnessed expansive involvements of U.S. majors like AIG, New York Life, Chubb, American Express, Citicorp, and GE Capital. AT&T and Qualcomm have established a foothold in the rapidly expanding telecommunications field. Major U.S. corporate entities have identified the knowledge economy as a new sector offering tremendous potential for cooperation between the two countries. My advice to American business would be the following. Don't miss the opportunity of claiming a share in the largest and fastest growing economy in the free world. The third component is knowledge and culture. Every country has a uniqueness embedded in its own history and culture. When it comes to India and the United States, the range of socio-cultural linguistic diversities in both countries offer few parallels in any other part of the world. If the Pilgrim Fathers set the tone to the hustle and bustle, variety and dynamism of U.S. society, more than 5,000 years of unbroken history provide India with a civilization and cultural foundation for our march into the new millennium. The visibility of Indian culture in the U.S. is increasing, from art to food to fashion to Bollywood movies. The best envoys of India have been the nearly 2 million Indian Americans living in the United States. Through their sheer professional excellence, family values and hard work, they have brought a part of India to the US mainland. A large proportion of doctors, engineers, and employees of high-tech companies such as Microsoft, IBM, Intel hail from India. The number of Indian students has more than doubled in less than a decade, from 35,000 in 1993-94 to 75,000 in 2002 and 2003. India today contributes the largest number of foreign students to the United States. As President Bush mentioned, half in jest, while India has many bright minds, most of them now reside in the west coast of the United States. India is now the home of the largest pool of human resources and skilled manpower. The best minds in India and the US are working together on issues ranging from DNA printing to genome sequencing to biotechnology to nanotechnology. If knowledge is the vehicle of the future, Indians and Americans are in the driving seat. Friends, let me conclude by thanking you all once again for giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts. Indo-U.S. relations have indeed entered a phase of unprecedented warmth and proximity. Both our countries have clear commonalities in shaping a democratic and pluralistic world order. By coming closer together and welding the spiritual, cultural, political, and economic resources of our two peoples, we can confidently change the destiny of the world in the 21st century. I thank you for your patience.
His Excellency has a little bit of time left and would like to take some questions. We have a roving microphone, and for the sake of our webcast recording, we'd ask that you please raise your hand, and when you're called upon, we'll bring the microphone to you.
Mr. Ambassador, appreciate your very positive projection of India and our relations. Some have said, though, there's a ticking bomb in the Islamic problem and in nationalistic Hinduism. Could you comment on that, please?
Well, as I mentioned, India is the home of all the religions in the world. We have 8 major religions. And for centuries, these religions have lived not only side by side, but in harmony. So if you look at the totality of India's experience, it is religious harmony. I can't think of many other countries where religions have migrated to a country and have established themselves and survived there. So I don't deny that there are extremist elements in every religion. But what you have to remember is that the history of India points to religious tolerance and religious harmony. We have aberrations from time to time, but because we have a strong secular tradition and because we have strong democratic institutions, we're able to cope with the problem. Now, Islamic fundamentalism is an issue. It's nothing to do with Islam. I think it's a misinterpretation of a great religion. Any Muslim that I have spoken to emphasizes that Islam does not require its followers to kill non-believers or to use violence or to indulge in suicide. That is not a part of the religion. But what is happening is that a minority of Muslims have hijacked the religion and they're carrying on acts of terrorism. We have to be mindful of that. And I'm glad you raised the issue, because in India we feel that the root causes of this terrorism have not yet been seriously addressed. I know that the U.S. has had a campaign in Afghanistan and is conducting a campaign in Iraq, and part of the mission is to deal with international terrorism. But in our perspective, it's not the Bin Ladens and the Mullah Omars who are on the flee, on the move right now. It's the Bin Ladens and Mullah Omars of tomorrow and day after that you have to look after. And these are being trained right now in religious schools called the madrasas. There are 15,000 madrasas in Pakistan which are training about 750,000 young men, not just religion, but training them in terrorism. That's what we should address. And that's what has not received sufficient attention from the world yet.
You just mentioned Pakistan. The U.S. is also strong allies with Pakistan along with India. How do you foresee that, and what part does that play in your stance towards Pakistan, understanding that the U.S. depends heavily upon Pakistan for logistical support in their war, well, not war, but current standing in Afghanistan?
Well, we have no problem with the U.S. having better relations with Pakistan. And you may not believe it, but if the U.S. helps Pakistan economically and makes it more stable, I think it's in our security interest. A strong, stable, and I'd like to say a democratic Pakistan is good for India. So anything that the U.S. does to enhance democracy or raise the economic levels of Pakistan is a positive thing for us. But when the U.S. supplies weapons to Pakistan, that is a problem. Firstly, a country which is on the verge of economic collapse doesn't need guns. It probably doesn't need butter either, but more basic ingredients to sustain it. But when the U.S. decides to supply weapons, and we know that historically American weapons supplied to Pakistan have been used against only one country, that is India. So we are cautioning our friends in the administration that it's not such a good thing to give Pakistan a lot of weaponry which is likely to be used against us. This is in addition to the terrorism that we are facing from there. Thank you.
Mr. Ambassador, you mentioned that there's a lot of collaboration between India and America. I was just wondering if you'd comment on the Americanization which is taking place in India and the effects on the culture and just first world values being inflicted on Indians, you know.
Well, let me give you my personal perspective on this. I know that a lot of people are concerned that our traditional values are being swept over by what you call American values. This is really a globalization process, where when you watch television, you see America coming to your drawing room, to your bedroom. So you can't avoid the influence. But let me say this about India. India has a strong traditional culture, and India also has a record of assimilation. Now, a lot of us believe that what we have today in India is 100% Indian, has always been Indian. We forget that many of these influences came from outside. It came from the Middle East, from Iran, from Afghanistan, from the Arabs, from the Europeans, from the Portuguese, from the Dutch, the Danes, the British, the French. So we have a legacy of assimilation. But at the same time, we have a strong sense of preserving what we think are our core cultural values. So I have no fears. Nobody stops Indian girls from learning ballroom dancing or waltz. But the fact is, by choice, they go in for classical Indian dancing. Nobody forces Indians to have a different dress code. But the fact is, Indian women still wear saris out of choice. So I don't fear the influence. When we started McDonald's in India and Kentucky Fried Chicken, people said, well, what's going to happen to tandoori chicken? Are we going to lose our values? Nothing of the sort has happened. I think our traditional producers of fast food are doing even better than before.
You mentioned in a context of the Cold War a tendency towards isolationist thought or unilateral thought existing in India. Could you comment on how that relates to perceptions in India of recent unilateral policy by the United States, particularly in Iraq?
Well, let me, maybe I didn't get through properly. I wasn't implying that India had become unilateral during the Cold War period. But I was referring to a perspective from Washington, that India was not in Washington's camp of friends. India was on the other side. It was a misperception. All we wanted to say was, we have become independent. We don't want to join either the Soviet bloc or the American bloc. We want to be non-aligned. But non-aligned was a bad word in Washington. You remember John Foster Dulles saying, you're either with us or against us, something which is also sounding very familiar today. But the world is not divided in black and white, and you must allow for shades of gray. So the perspective that we would like to offer is that unilateralism is never a good policy, that you have to carry the world with you. Nobody disputes that the United States, the most powerful nation on earth, politically, economically, militarily, and so on. But a lot of global problems cannot be solved unilaterally. The whole world has to cooperate. That's how we see it.
There have been some recent military exercises between China and India. First of all, why has there been recent warming between those two countries? And second of all, what does that mean for Indo-American relations?
Well, we've now come to the conclusion that we can improve relations with a country without reducing our relations with others. It's not a zero-sum game. It's like we have excellent relations with Israel, but it is not at the cost of our good relations with the Arab countries. We have developed close relations with Moscow. Earlier, Washington didn't like it. And I like to give this example that when Mr. Bajpai came here on his first visit a few years ago, he was coming from a visit to Moscow. And the plane came from Moscow to Washington. And I made this comment that during the Cold War period, he might have been sent back and not welcomed here. So we are seeing a phase where you can have good relations with another country. Now with China, we've had a troubled relationship. China actually invaded India in 1962. And we still have an unresolved border dispute with China. But then we figured out that if you keep relations frozen, you have to wait till eternity. So we took a conscious decision that we'll put our differences in a box. And where we don't have differences, we should cultivate our relations. This is what has happened. The border issue is being discussed separately. We have raised the level of political discussion to bring that to a settlement. But so far as trade exchanges are concerned, we are going full steam with that. Our trade has increased from $2 billion in about 3 years ago to about $6 billion today. People-to-people exchanges are taking place, cultural exchanges are taking place. We don't see why we shouldn't have normal relations, even though we have certain differences on some vital issues. What impact will it have on the U.S.? I don't think any, because the U.S. is doing the same thing. You have concerns about China, and yet you are having good relations with China. After all, Jiang Zemin was given the greatest honor of being invited to Crawford by President Bush, and the Chinese Prime Minister has just been to the White House.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you for your visit and for your good words here today. I apologize beforehand because I'm also going to ask for your personal perspective. If Gandhiji were with us here today and listened to the good report that you've given, I'm curious as to what you believe, how he would feel about that, how he would feel about the changes and the growth of India, the relationship with other nations. If he were here, what do you believe he would agree with and appreciate, and perhaps what concerns he may have?
Thank you. Well, there's one thing we have to understand about Mahatma Gandhi. I think people make a mistake when they put him on a pedestal and worship him as a saint, and then they look at his words and think this is the gospel truth. Gandhi was a very pragmatic leader. He was a prophet, he was a saint. But he was also a very good political leader. And he used to adjust his strategies depending on the circumstances without being unfaithful to his basic beliefs in truth and non-violence. I personally think Gandhiji would be happy to see the world today in terms of how globalization has taken place, how friendship has developed, how societies have evolved, and there is much more equality in societies than before. We had problems with the caste system in the past. We are resolving those issues. You had problems of slavery in the United States. And mind you, I remember Gandhiji had written a letter to President Roosevelt expressing concern about the situation of the blacks in the United States. He never got a reply. So he would be a happier person seeing the level of living going up and so on. Also of growing harmony between people. But he would be a sadder person looking at the situation of terrorism today. Because what would have really shaken him, broken his heart, is the use of religion to justify violence. Because Gandhiji used religion to reduce violence. All his meetings began with prayers from the Holy Quran, from the Bible, from the Vedas, from the Zoroastrian scriptures, from the Judaic scriptures. And to think that today there are people who are committing suicide, blowing up places, killing innocent people in the name of God, that would have saddened him the most.
One more question.
Mr. Ambassador, India's role in the UN has always been undermined, considering it's such a big country and doesn't have a permanent seat in the Security Council. Has that changed anything in the past few years of the U.S. stance of having India as a permanent member in the Security Council?
A very good question. It's no secret that we aspire to be permanent members of the Security Council. And we think we have the qualification, better than many of the existing members. To start with, we are, in terms of our population, the second largest country, and unfortunately a few years' time, we will be the most populous country in the world. But we will also be the largest democracy. We will always be. We have an economy which, according to Goldman Sachs, is going to be the third largest in the world very soon. And we have been good members of the United Nations. No other country has lost so many soldiers and officers in peacekeeping operations as India. We have taken part in almost all the UN peacekeeping operations. So when you put all this together, I don't think many countries can have this kind of track record and the qualification to be permanent members. Now, we have received open support from Russia, from Britain, from France, and we have not given up hopes that the United States will support us. I was heartened to see that the media has been suggesting this for a long time. And if you remember an article written by Tom Friedman in the New York Times some time ago, he said, why not throw out France and put India in place? I wouldn't like to comment on France, but we... Thank you.